Every morning, Mrs. W and I have a ritual, a morning ritual we go through that's pretty much goes something like this. We wake up, I start the fire in the wood stove, she starts the coffee, we sit together on the couch with our computer and go through and answer and read a lot of the comments from the previous day's video. She looked at me first thing this morning and said, if you don't get back to the 10 most important tools, tool belt tools, the video list, there's going to be a full-fledged revolt. So today, we're going to hit number 2 of the most important tools that every man needs to have in his tool belt. By your request, hands down the most requested, the speed square. So the speed square is one of those things that I just couldn't live without. One of the most important tools that I own. I just can't say enough about it. So how should it be worn and how should it be oriented? Well, if you're right-handed, now this is just for me. Some guys have different opinions. The speed square, pencil, tape measure combination are something that's going to be personal preference. This is just my preference. It's maybe not the best, it maybe not be the fastest, but I'm not a production carpenter and I tend to want to kind of default on the accuracy side because I have a little bit more time at my leisure. So the speed square should be worn if you're right-handed on your left. That's typically, and when you're buying tool belts, don't buy a tool belt that doesn't have a dedicated place for a speed square. This, the Occidentals here make just perfect use of a space that just wouldn't be usable simply by stitching the bags together and leather lining this for durability, and that speed square fits in there and it never falls out. Problem with the speed square, if you have a tool belt, an inferior brand that doesn't have a dedicated pocket for it, it's always falling out on the ground. And that's bad for the square, it's bad for your patience when you're up on a ladder and that happens and you need it. So when you're buying a tool belt, make sure you source it. Some people prefer to have their pencil, I've seen this right here, that these two tools work hand in hand. You grab your pencil, you grab your speed square, you have everything that you need to do your marking. However, you have to, for me, being right-handed, I have to switch hands. And then I don't like that method. Plus, having a tool that sticks out like this, even that level, is going to catch on everything. Your tool, your extension cords on your skill saws are going to catch on here. If you're a plumber, if you're crawling through trusses and joists, it's going to catch. So having anything here, when I get in a situation like that, I remove it. I want to go fast attack, fast and light, and not have any of that stuff that's going to hang up on me. But if you're just doing layout, if you're working at the chop saw and you're cutting for other framers, then that's fine. You can grab both of these really quickly, although no, you do have to change hands. So what I prefer is to have my pencil here on this side, close in where it's protected. It's protected in there and it's never going to get broken off. I've got my tape measure here. So when I cut, there's 3 tools that I use. I'm going to lay my, let me show you my cutting technique. Okay, you got to cut a board. Here is how I do it. If you want to be accurate and efficient, I'll tell you what, if you're a young guy, if you're going to be signing on, working into construction, one of the first jobs you're going to be given, you're going to be the board cutter. Right after you're the cleanup guy or the tool fetcher, you're going to be the board cutter. And you need to be able to do a couple things. You need to be able to read a tape measure, and you need to be able to cut square boards to the proper length. I mean, heaven help the guy that's down the ground and starts setting studs and headers and things up there that have to come back down and be recut. You do not want to be that guy. So one way to be really accurate is this. You take your speed square out of your tool belt. First thing you do is you lay it down. This is a 2x6. Let's say we're going to cut this, a stud or whatever. Take my tape measure, throw that out there, hook it on the edge, lay it down, and lock it. All of that motion is very quick. So having my tool belt set up the way that I can, I walk up to the board, I put it down, I got 2 hands, speed square, tape measure comes out, it lays down, I lock it. A good tape measure like this with a rubber bottom is nice because you don't have to lock it and it won't slide. So there it is. So if I want to make my cut here, I've got my tape measure, I simply run my square up to exactly what the measurement's going to be. So for example, say we're going to cut a 4-foot board, right? I simply, because my speed square is underneath, I slide it up, not to the 4 inches or the 4 feet, because if I mark on the 4 foot with the pencil line, the pencil has a thickness, right? It's going to be too big. So you want to come back, you know, these lines are 1/16 of an inch. So when I'm laying this out, I'll come back. So if I'm going to cut 4, I'm going to come back between the 15/16 and the 4 halfway, and that, if I keep my pencil sharp, and I know how thick it is going to, once I make that mark, it's going to be perfectly placed exactly where I want it. So the speed square is got these nice grooves in it. You simply put your fingers in there, pull it tight, make a mark. It's going to be absolutely perfect every time. So here's how it looks in real time. This is a really quick, efficient way to do it. I walk up, I put my speed square down, I throw my tape measure out, I lay it down, grab my pencil, I bring it up. It's easy, I can see it exactly where it's at. My speed square is marking my spot. Hold it, pull it in, put my tools away. I'm ready to make my cut. Perfect cuts every time. It's very fast, it's very efficient, it's very consistent. So there is a myriad of uses for the speed square. I'm just going to cover the top 5, the most popular ways that guys use them. We're not going to get into hips and valleys and rafter measurements. You can do all of those things, figuring roof pitches with it. For most of us, we're simply going to use it for these 5 basic functions. And the first is being a simple square. Having a pocket reference that we can check everything immediately for square. The ends of boards, you know, when you buy lumber from, it's better than it used to be, but they're not always square. So if you have this out that's an 1/8 or 3/16 or so, your cuts are going to be wrong. They're not going to be right. So to get a good practice to see right there, here's a factory cut, and it's a 1/16 off. I can know that really quickly by using my speed square. So just having a regular 90-degree square for squaring up other things as well. How about your skill saw table? Squaring up the fences and tables on your power tools is something that you should do before you start your workday, because the factory stops are not always accurate. The factory measurements, I mean, tools get dropped in toolboxes and stepped on and dropped, and all of those things come out of whack. Take a screw or a 16-penny nail and pin that guard back. Make sure it's unplugged, obviously. But what we're trying to do is, you know, that this is all the same for a table saw or for a skill saw or for a jigsaw or any of the saws that you have. Ouch, I hate, oh, it does it to me every time. Lost some hide there. So this here enables us to make miter cuts, right? Same with our table saw, except for the blade turn. So what we can do, having this quick reference that we know is absolutely right, is to lay that on there and just double check that our tools are cutting square. Now be careful with your blades, because there's a kerf on these carbide tips. They're a little bit wider so that the body of the saw blade doesn't get caught in the kerf. You don't want to be measuring on top of one of those bumps. You want to come in between the teeth, the cutting teeth, and right there I can see that this is actually quite a bit off when we're using the stops. So here's our tool, whatever it is, with a tilting house, right? Bring it back to the stop. Our speed square, we run it up between the teeth. See there? See how it's making contact there at the bottom but not the top? That tells us that our saw is not going to cut properly. So by rotating this down and continuing to check it till we're perfectly square, now we can lock down the tool and know that we are going to be making perfect 90-degree cuts. Goodness, we're still on number 1. We've still got 4 more to go. I want to show you a couple things here, though. Another use. I mean, we're still on this, using the square aspect of the square, why it's so useful. So let's say we're laying out our studs, right? We're on 16-inch center. All right, so remember, when you do your layouts, you always put an X on one side, and you know that your stud falls to that side of it. We'll talk more about layouts when we come to tape measure. So right there is where our stud needs to go, right? Right there on that line. All right, so let's say we're using a nail gun or a screw gun or whatever. We stick one side of it. Well, always, inevitably, this thing is going to turn. And it's hard to see, especially if you're working in darker areas. So what I typically do is I'll nail one side of the stud, and then I'll throw my speed square down, and I can simply rotate this until it's perfectly 90. And, you know, some guys don't worry about it. It's maybe a step, they say a time-wasting step, but I like to do things the best I can. When I walk away from it, I want the framing to be as good as I can do it. So you can see there, I've seen studs nailed in like that, and that really throws a problem for guys in the future. Because what you're doing when you're cutting corners and you're doing shoddy work, especially starting with the foundation guys, is you're passing along the aggravations, and your shoddy work is making other guys' life miserable. Because when you start doing this, now the drywallers are coming and they're counting on everything being 16-inch centers, and because you were lazy and you did poor work, it makes that poor guy's job just that much more difficult, all the way on to the finished carpenters, and don't even get me started with that. So just taking a moment like that, putting your screw in, bringing that up there, making sure that it's nice and done properly is just, it's a step that just takes a second, and I think it's just good style. The second, not in any particular order, one of the more useful things that you're going to use the speed square for is as a, what do you call it, a protractor. A protractor, so you need to figure an angle. Oh, automatically you have the 45s on there if you want to do miters or different things, but right here is a pivot point. It says pivot right on it. And as you rotate this, holding this pivot point fast to the edge, there's degrees over here. So if I want to make a 5-degree cut, I simply roll up until I'm showing the number 5 on there and make a line. And there's what? There's my 5 degrees. Or if I want to do a 22.5, I bring it up here, make my mark, and now I'm at 22.5. All the way up, I can go clear on up, of course, to the 90 degrees. And I can use that as a protractor to figure all of my angles. Very useful for all sorts of things, especially when you're doing miters. So the number 3 of the top uses for your speed square is going to be as a saw guide. What does it mean? What do I mean by a saw guide? So our skill saw, right, as we're running it through the board and following a line, have a tendency to do this. And the more skilled you are, the more you do this, the better you get at it. For guys that are occasional users like myself, having a little assistance or something to run along is of great benefit. Now, it's not such a big deal if we're just cutting a 90-degree cut off of the board where we're just cutting it to length. If it's not perfect as a stud, it's not the end of the world. However, when we start doing miters and we're going to have to cut 2 pieces that are going to fit together, then it's critical that this cut be absolutely straight. So the skill saws, whether it be a worm drive like this or a circular, are going to have this base plate, or a table they're going to call it, that's flat. This one here has got a nice flat magnesium table that's very similar in running length to the speed square. So I can pull my speed square, and I'm going to make that cut, make the mark out of here, and by pressing it firmly and getting my fingers, I get my fingers, even if I can get them on the inside of these cutouts here, pushing lots of pressure. I do not want this to move. I'll put this on my mark, line up my blade, and then when I'm ready to make my cut, I'll turn this in, make sure that I'm sitting up hard against my fence, and I'll run that through there, using that as a straight edge, as a guide to make a perfect cut. Before we do that, I want to share a story, talk a little bit about pinning guards back. So, skill saws like this have a guard right here. If I take the screw out, that we use right there, now this guard comes closed, right? It shuts down. So when I'm through with my cut, it automatically comes down. So when I sit the saw down, or it brushes on my leg or anything, that guard covers it and the saw is not going to take off and do something stupid. And it's always there, and it's actually, for guards go, as far as guards go, it's a pretty good one. It's one you can live with. But there are times when it's unhandy and you can't cut very well with it. That's why it's got a handle on it. So especially, let's say when we're cutting rafter tails overhead, we'll hold that guard back like here and make those cuts and then release it when you're done cutting. So back in the day, I used to work with some framing crews, and we would pin the guards back with a nail, like this. This is a big no-no, and I'll tell you why. What happened to a cousin of mine that did this very thing and almost lost his life from it. So the reason why, see, you pin your guards back, and now you can cut and cut and cut, keep both hands on the saw. You don't have to worry about fooling around with the guard. I get that. I've done that myself. But what he was doing was he was cutting rafter tails. He was cutting and cutting, moving over. He's working with his brother, and he just cut one. And when you release the trigger, the saw is still spooling down and the blade is still turning. Big jagged teeth on it. He made his cut. He brought his saw down like that. Right when his brother was walking up behind him to get his attention, putting his hand on his shoulder, and he dropped this blade unguarded right on his brother's thigh as that was spooling down. And you can imagine, you look at the teeth, what that would do to human flesh. And spinning slow like that, it makes it even worse. I mean, it's like a chainsaw injury. Terrible. So if you're tempted to pin your guards back like that, just be really careful with it. I know that in the real world sometimes it happens, but very, very dangerous. So this will demonstrate how important it is to have that speed square as a saw guide on these miters. So I've got my saw set there at an angle. Let's say we're going to cut a miter, right? We're going to do some sort of a pattern. I want to make sure that I'm hard and fast up against the fence, holding it securely. Now I can make my straight cut. Now if we check our miter, now because we use the speed square as a guide, and we use that as a nice straight edge for our saw, we've got a very clean, very tight miter right there. I mean, we're not talking about finished carpentry here, but this would be really something considered to be done very well, very properly in your framing or your basic construction there. And if we check it there with our speed square, of course, you know, we're absolutely square. So a great trick, just that in itself. So the number 4 useful thing for speed square, the most commonly used things. Now, I got to preface this. This particular speed square is not one that I would recommend. This one's made by Empire. This is not the original Swanson speed square. If you're going to buy a speed square, speaking of which, would be a great gift for your loved ones, I'm going to put these in my Amazon store, wranglermart.com. wranglermart.com. I'll see if I can't locate the proper Swanson version. I don't know why I got this. I would imagine that I needed one, and that's what was available at Home Depot or wherever I was at the time. But the Swansons, here, what we're going to do here is we're going to use a speed square for marking lines here. Let's say that we want to cut a strip off of a sheet of plywood, or we want to cut this in half, or we want a 2-inch furring strip off of this. Right here on the edge, we can see the graduated numbers. We go from 1 to 6 right there. What you can do is if let's say we want to cut this 2.5, we'll go to the 2.5 mark right there, putting our pencil in there. Now make sure when our pencil that we're laying it away from the body. We don't want to go this way because the pencil jumps and jabs and sticks into every deformity in the wood, but laying it down towards us, and they're guessing as best we can with our finger on the square so it doesn't move. I can run down the full length of a sheet of plywood or 2x or whatever, making that line, marking perfectly off that factory edge that strip that I want. Now, why I like the Swanson so much better than the Empires is that they have an area that's cut out, and it's got, I believe, 1/4-inch increments with little divots in it that you can actually slip your pencil into. So your pencil rides in there. You don't have to do this hold it on the outside nonsense. You can simply just put it right in there, and it's a wonderful way. So just to have the ability to quickly mark off strips for sheet goods, for cutting framing members, whatever you want, is a great trick. You know, I thought I had 5 things I wanted to talk about. I don't know where the 5th one. Maybe I covered it already. One last thing that I use it for is on pony walls, straightening the studs in pony walls, really small stuff, tiny stuff where you can't get your 4-foot level. This is not something you'd want to do on a full stud wall. You always want to use your level when you can, but sometimes, let's say you're just building a little wall that needs to fit up underneath something. You know, we got a stud wall, we'll just pretend this is our top plate, right? And our layout's on the bottom, or we haven't done the layout on the top or whatever, and we don't know, how do you know if this little stud is sitting, if it's plumb or not? The speed square is great for that. On that little wall, I'll secure the bottom, make sure that I'm on layout, and then I'll just quickly check right here. And if I'm not, I'll tap it over with my hammer. I check it here, I check it here. I square both sides really quickly, really efficiently, and it fits in really tiny areas. I'll also, it may be better, depends on the application, to use a small torpedo level, if that fits as well. They kind of both do the same thing, but it's a little bit more guesswork with the level. It's kind of open to interpretation, where the speed square is absolutely definitive. Interesting side note, my father has houseboat mortgages, several of them. And growing up, we did a lot of remodeling and did a lot of building of houseboats and houseboat rafts. The interesting thing about houseboats, because they were on a river, and the river has a slight tilt to it, you can't use a level, because the level you'll build crooked. So everything when you're building has to be done with a square. Kind of just something you don't think about when building something on an uneven surface. You always think that the level is the absolute definitive answer, but not always. So remember some time back we used to show strange tools that I didn't know what they were, to try to hold kind of a contest to see who could identify one? My new friend and subscriber Carrie from Georgia sent 2 planes. The other one I'll be featuring in a future video, but this one in particular was really stumping me. I had no idea what it was. Let's see if you know what this thing is. It's a plane with a small wooden handle on it. You can see that it's got a thumb screw on it. It's got a rotating, it's a little bit rusty, but the head rotates. So it's to follow something or some sort of an uneven wood or whatever. It's got a real traditional planer blade. It's crude, you know, there's no micro or fine adjustments for it. It's got a really big throat. So that tells us also that it's not something that was really intended for precision work, but to take a lot of wood quickly. Now when he sent this, he said, I have no idea what this is. I mean, I've looked all over, I can't figure it out, but I thought it was interesting, and I'm going to send it to you. Maybe you can use it or find out what it's for. And then right after it arrived, he figured it out, and it sent me a link to what it was, and I would have never guessed it, not in a million years, what this was for. I believe that they were made by Stanley. I don't know if this particular one was. I can't find a lot of markings on it, but I haven't looked really close. But let me know in the comments if you have any idea what this is. I know what it is, and I'll announce it in the next video or so. But see who the smarty is. If you can figure out what this is and what it was intended for originally. So that's it. That's the bonus footage. So we'll see you guys on the next video.